Okay.
Yep.
Well, then I would like to welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm based here in Hong Kong, and Andy and Debbie are in Singapore in the same time zone. So we thought it's a good idea to try something new at the time when many of us are under some form of lockdown. I think all three of us are at home at the moment and not in our regular office setting. And, when I talked to explorers over the last couple of weeks, there was many times the wish just to get to know more of the amazing people that are within this network, to see what they're doing, and maybe to foster ideas for collaboration, to get new ideas, to share experiences, and maybe also to inspire each other. So that's what today is all about. So I guess what we're going to witness is the process of Debbie and Andy getting to know each other in front of an audience. Funnily, they're both conservationists from Singapore, so there are not a lot of those. But funnily, they have known of each other, but they have not yet met each other and don't know each other very well. So they have a rough idea, and we'll be able to witness them this afternoon, and by witnessing them, learning more about the work that they do and who they are as people. So I think, this is, I guess, raw and unscripted, and all of you have at the end, after 25, 30 minutes, I think the opportunity to ask any questions. If you want to do so, please do raise your hand or use the chat function. And we'd like to ask you to keep the camera off and to stay on mute so that everybody has a good sound experience through this. So I think that's all I wanted to say and kick it off. And I'm looking forward to find. I mean, even though I know both of them, I'm sure that I'll find out new things this afternoon. So I'll pass it on to Debbie, who, by the way, has done similar things with other explorers, and I've shared the links on YouTube. So I do recommend to check those out, because that's an opportunity to get to know some of the other explorers here in the Asia region, and I think one from Brazil as well, right? So thanks, and over to you, Debbie.
Thanks, Yannick, for giving us a platform to get to know each other more in depth with an audience. So actually, Andie and I have met on a few occasions, but not had the opportunity to really, interact in depth. So this is going to be fun. Just to catch everyone up on how this whole idea for these conversations came into being. So National Geographic had a leadership in a time of crisis workshop, which was led by Lisa Witter. And during that meeting, it came to the surface that some of us are in a better situation than others during this crisis. Some people are feeling really isolated, but they all, these are all people who are used to being very active, going outside, doing field work, interacting with colleagues in their labs, and now they're all isolated at home. So I thought it would be a good idea to use this opportunity use this crisis as an opportunity to actually connect and create. And so that's how these recordings have come into being. And today I'm super excited because, as Yannick said, I have a very special person to chat with, who does very exciting work in my home country of Singapore, Andie Ng, who's a primatologist, and she is the president of the Jane Goodall Institute in Singapore, a research scientist at the Wildlife Reserves Singapore Conservation Fund, and a fellow National Geographic Explorer. And so we're both city girls, and as Yannick said, have interestingly, in an unplanned but sort of planned way, arrived in this path. Andie has an interesting story about how her first interaction with wildlife started, and that was when you had a pet monkey. How old were you then, and what was it like looking after a pet monkey, Andie?
Yeah, so first of all, hello everyone, and thanks Yannick and Debbie for the opportunity to just have a chat with everyone. Speaking about the monkey, so it was completely illegal, not supposed to have a monkey. It was when I was 10 years old when we had relatives who were sailors to Africa. And so back in the 1990s and actually up to now, there's still a lot of illegal wildlife trade happening. And so this relative of ours came back with a pet vervet monkey. And at that time, I didn't know what's the difference between like a wild animal and a domestic one. So I had the pet monkey for about 5 years, looking after it like I would to a dog or to a cat. So I'll bring him down to like my neighborhood on my bicycle to take walks and meet people. So at that time, people will only ask, where do you get the monkey from? It's so cute, it's exotic. They wouldn't tell you that, hey, this was probably illegal. So it took me about, that period of time of 5 years to interact with him every day to realize that he's probably very miserable, chained up at home, and without his playmate in the wild. So I contacted ACRES, the Animal Concerns Research and Education Society in Singapore, started by Louis Ng. And in 2004, that was also the first year that ACRES got started. And my pet monkey was the first wildlife that was actually sent back, repatriated back to where it came from. I guess this experience kind of got me interested to find out more about monkeys and how I can help. So that's how I got started. How about you, Debbie?
So incidentally, I was on the founding committee of ACRES, and I do remember that pervert monkey. But it's really funny that I didn't know who the monkey belonged to before it was repatriated. Yeah, I mean, how I first became acquainted with animals was actually at an animal shelter, and I think all these stories are quite interesting for people, especially living in cities, because sometimes, and especially now, we're talking a lot about the disconnect from animals. So that we have to find other ways, right, to connect with animals. And so I spent a lot of time. I started when I was 8 years old. I would spend all my school holidays at the local animal shelter. So it's just domestic animals, dogs and cats. But just like a very nerdy child, after, once I was done cleaning up all the animal poop in the animal shelter, I would go to the library in the animal shelter, and I was just reading and watching videos about all the different ways that humans use animals in science and entertainment, for recreation. And similar to you, I had that moment where suddenly I saw and realized all these things that, from our very isolated environment, because we're not in those places, we don't know that all this stuff is happening outside. And that really transformed my view of how humans interact with animals. Of course, at that point, I didn't think, oh, I'm going to become a conservationist. But the first question I asked was, how can I make this better? Basically, that was it. And when I was 8, how I could make this better was, just try and create better living conditions for the animals around me. And during that process, I met a lot of wonderful people, just like, we're connecting now, from all different fields. Some were working with animals in industry, some were working with animals in science and research. And then, through those connections, I got to know about those issues deeper. I got to sort of reflect on how I could participate in those different fields as well. And one of the things I did, like, really early in the day was help create the draft for what was Singapore's, at that time, a revised version of the animal ethics for animals in experimentation. So those are ways that I think, anybody, you don't have to be in the field. It's a very desk-bound academic exercise. And I was in my early 20s, I think, when I was involved in that. But I also have a very diverse field. I just realized that, I forgot to tell everyone what I do. So I'm a journalist and a wildlife disease ecologist. And I work both in Singapore, protecting coral reefs, working with volunteer groups, as well as in the Himalaya, where I work with communities to set up what is intended to be Nepal's first community disease alert network in the Himalaya. So basically, I'm looking at how landscape change could be affecting the potential for emerging diseases to impact wild and domestic animals. And of course, all of these animals, wild or domestic, are really important to people. So Andie is now working on a huge project. I'm gonna bounce back to Singapore to protect a little, by global scales, a little forest, but very important forest in Singapore. Because, and I always get very amazed by whenever I think about Andie, because you couldn't find a more difficult animal to work with in a city. A large endangered primate. That is really challenging. So how does one, grow up in a place like Singapore and go, I'm gonna be a primatologist?
Yeah, so after my experience with my pet monkey, I wanted to learn more about primates. But in Singapore, at that time and even now, there are very limited opportunities for learning about primates or anthropology. So what I did in the NUS, the National University of Singapore, was to look at hand preferences of primates. Because like 90% of humans, we are right-handed. So I was really interested to see if non-human primates show the same trend. I started with Singapore Zoo, looking at some of the animals that they have over there, like the proboscis monkey and the Scoloruses. Afterwards, I had a chance to go to Thailand to look at the wild gibbons. And that's when I got really interested in field work, running in the forest and jungle, looking for primates. So for my master's, I wanted to learn more about the primates, especially the endangered ones that we have in Singapore. And that's what you mentioned about this big primate that's really, really shy, called a Raffles banded langur. It's a leaf-eating monkey. So it spends a lot of time up in the trees, and because they're so shy, it's hard to find. And when you approach, they would see you as a threat, so they will run away. It took me about 2 months to get them used to my presence, that I'm not a threat. So I'll be wearing like the same clothes, same backpack, same hairstyle. And so they would, stay and let me, collect data and photograph them. And if you were to cut your hair, so what I did was, there was one time I cut my hair because it's so hot in Singapore, right? And the next day when I went to see them, they ran away from me. So it took me another 1 month for them to recognize that, hey, it's me. It's the same me. So then they allow me to follow again to observe them. And you mentioned about the banded langur being highly endangered because it's only found in Singapore and the southern parts of Malaysia. So it has a very, very small distribution. And globally, we're talking about 300 to 400 individuals left, which is why it's very important to preserve the habitat that they have in Singapore and Malaysia. And also one of the challenge is whether we can facilitate some kind of conservation genetic exchange or translocation so that the populations between in Singapore and Malaysia can mix and you can increase their chances of survival.
Yeah. And that is very relevant to some of the work that I do. Tell us, how does mixing the genes make them more likely to survive?
So because they have very, very small population, and over time when they do mate, they have very low genetic diversity. So it's similar to humans, right? When you're closely related to each other, and if they are mating that happen, inbreeding happen, and then the immune system of the next generation will be much lower. And so they're more vulnerable to disease and viruses and things like that. So they might not survive into juvenilehood or adulthood. So they will die prematurely. So this is what we hope will not happen. And one way to prevent that from happening is to facilitate some kind of genetic exchange. So that's what you've been doing as well, is it?
Well, no, I wanted you to touch on the bit about how that genetics impacts their immunity and the susceptibility to disease, because that's what I do. And one of the things in Nepal that has been very exciting that we have been doing is trying to make the community more disease aware. So in the past, when an animal dies, it is basically thrown away. There is no opportunity or facilities to do an autopsy or actually find out why the animal died. Sometimes, it's more of like an educated guess based on, what they may have known happened to an animal in the past. So what we have done is we have started, making people aware of the different types of symptoms. When you see an animal before it died, what were the symptoms? Can we track? It's very classical detective work. It's very low tech science, very rigorous kind of interviewing people, finding out, and it'll be surprising that a lot of epidemiology starts like that, especially when it comes to emerging diseases. Emerging diseases, when they happen, they don't have a name yet, right? There's no pattern, because it's new. It doesn't have a name, doesn't have a pattern. So the only way that these patterns start to be built is really through interviewing the cases, finding out where they go, and that's what we're doing with animals. So basically, the stuff like social distancing we're doing with the dogs as well. So why we're looking at dogs is because dogs are the main vector of a type of pathogen called distemper, which is related to the measles virus in humans. And for a long time, since the 70s, it was thought that distemper only affected canines, so like foxes, wolves, all those kind of animals. But then recently they started infecting animals like badgers, civets, red panda in zoos, snow leopards, cats, tigers in Siberia, lions in India and in Africa. And most recently in Southeast Asia, it was a rhesus macaque that was tested positive for distemper. So it's a really fascinating disease in that it keeps mutating to be able to infect new hosts. And yeah, so that's why it's really important that rather than just rely on researchers, my take, the way I see it is that it's globally distributed in all kinds of habitat, from alpine areas to tropical jungles. Is in every single continent except Antarctica. And if we rely just on researchers to go out there in the field to detect these things, it's pretty much close to impossible. But what if people had that knowledge and that information? They don't have to actively do it, but just having that awareness, the idea of that there are these diseases in the back of their minds, the next time they see something, they become more sensitive to it. And this sensitivity is not dissimilar from the kind of sensitivity you developed when you learned that wild animals kept in captivity don't live to their full lives. Is that same kind of, once you learn it, the next time any animal that you see, you identify that is not an ideal situation. And when I was a kid, my parents took me to, they were being good parents. They knew I liked animals. So when there was a zoo in town, a circus, they took me to the circus to see the wild animals. And I would ask them, can I go and take a picture with the tiger? At the time, I had no idea what was involved in getting the tiger there. Now I know that they're sedated, so that's why they're sort of sluggishly sitting there all the time. As little children go and sit next to them, it's horrible. And we didn't know that. And I think every time I approach people who are involved in that kind of activity, I think there's two types of ignorance that we deal with. The one kind of ignorance is to use a very extreme example, one type of ignorance is the flat earthers. And then the other type of ignorance is they just didn't know, and they're open to, and they're curious. So if they learn, like, oh, I didn't know that, so I'm going to modify my behavior. And not everyone who's engaged in those kind of behavior are doing it because they are fully aware of all the background, just like you and I, when we were doing those things, we weren't aware of the big picture. Speaking of, working with different types of people, so you work with, we were talking earlier about, so now in Singapore, there is a full lockdown just to catch everyone up. Only schools recently opened this week. Migrant workers, the bulk of which satisfy the construction and labor workforce in Singapore, some of them actually help Andie in her fieldwork. And I've always been very excited about that. I see you like dangling in the trees, putting out camera traps. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so part of my field research involved setting up camera traps on the trees in order to monitor movement of the langurs or other wildlife that can be found in the area, because we cannot be in the field 24/7, right? But with a camera there, it can actually help us, it can complement our field research by collecting data. And a lot of times people might think that researchers, they do the work and you have maybe park rangers as your support staff. But at least for my work, we have a lot of support from our migrant workers, especially when we are setting up the camera traps. So some trees we can climb with ropes, with all the secure safety equipment. But other trees which are really, really tall, you do need to have cranes to crane access to bring you up to the trees. And in order to have those cranes, they need to be operated. So we do have a team who are operating the cranes, so the contract workers. And because of this lockdown in Singapore, we can't actually go out to do field work. We can't check the cameras. And then, like you mentioned, right, a lot of the infection cases are affecting our migrant workers. So then I was just texting one of them about a week and a half ago to see what's happening, whether they are heavily affected by the lockdown. So yeah, they couldn't go out to work, and then they have to be isolated, even though they were not infected. They just can't go out to work anymore. So yeah, a lot of times we do require a lot of assistance and support from them.
Yeah, I think it is. It's something that we may not think about, the diverse skill sets involved in doing the research. It's not just made up of scientists. There are these people who are technicians as well, who may, from within their field, be totally unrelated to the kind of research that we are doing. I also want to find out about, so you have set up a bunch of rope bridges between forest fragments in Singapore to help the langurs overcome fragmented forests. What have you learned since setting up those ropes?
Yeah, so because we are due to a lot of development plans going on, you have forest habitats that are fragmented, isolated, and so it affects animal movement. And oftentimes they have to come down to the ground to cross the roads, and these are really dangerous. They will become roadkills, or they will sustain injuries. And so one of the ways that we can help is to put up artificial structures like rope bridges for the animals to use. In Singapore, it depends a lot on collaborations with relevant authorities and agencies. So like the National Parks Board or the Wildlife Reserve Singapore, where we identify areas where those are hotspots where animals are using to cross, because they are quite habitual animal. You can't just set up like rope bridges or artificial structures anywhere that you think the animals would use. It needs to depend on data that was collected. The animals keep using this area. So if you remove, or because of fragmentation, their natural canopy connectivity has been removed, you can put up structures over there. So in Singapore, we set up 2 rope bridges, and the langurs that I have been studying were using them since the beginning of this year. So that was really exciting. And relevant to the rope bridge project, it's what I was doing for the Net Geo project. And I need to really thank Net Geo and Yannick for their patience, because I got a grant in 2014, but I only completed it 5 years later. That was like last year. I was supposed to build road bridges in southern Vietnam, where there are a lot of limestone habitats, and there's this species of endangered langus living there. Because of the limestones, there are a lot of mining happening. So some companies were going into, whether it's overseas or local companies, going into, extract the minerals, to do mining activities there. And so the animals, including the langus, are confined in those habitats. They can't move to another area that are protected. So what I was supposed to do with the grant is to build a road bridge for them to move from one place to another. So why did it take 5 years? Was because the first year when we went in, we had to negotiate with the relevant authorities like the local government and also the mining company. So at that time, they were really cooperative. They want to do something good. So they want the animals to move out so that they can continue to mine the habitat. So we got this agreement, we got the papers signed and everything, but it's a long process. So the next year when I went back, I was planning to build the bridge. And then I realized the mining company has switched hands. So it's another company. And so they were asking, why was I there? So I had to do the whole process of negotiation again, telling them the reason why we're here and showing them the papers. But this second company was not really interested to do conservation. So then, we had to find other ways. For example, planting mangrove saplings, so that at least you can provide some food source for the langus while we wait for the bridge to be built. And then the third year came, the companies changed again. So then we did the whole thing again. And at that time, I had to write in the Nat Geo to say, please give me another year. I think we can do this. So sometimes we thought that maybe research or like some conservation project could be completed in a period of time. But because of a lot of the dynamic relationships and the different agencies involved, it will not go according to plans. So then last year, when finally the mangrove saplings have grown into mangrove trees, we can actually build a road bridge. And it took 1 week. The bridge was done in 1 week, but the whole project took 5 years. But anyway, it's done, and the langus have been using it, so that's a good thing. Yeah, so thanks for the patience.
So building road bridges, navigating social, political landscape, planting mangrove trees. Did you learn any of those in university?
No, and because I was in Vietnam, I'm not sure whether, have you been to Vietnam?
No, I haven't. Yeah.
So besides the political or like you said, navigating the whole relationships, there's also the cultural relationship that you need to build. And in Vietnam, they like to drink a lot. So when I was in Vietnam, I had to learn how to drink. Yeah, and so in the morning before field work, you have to drink in order to wish yourself good luck to find the langus. And then by evening time, when we come back to the field camp, if we didn't see the langus, we will have to drink also in order to wish us good luck the next day. But if we were to see the langus, they will also drink to celebrate. So it's oftentimes, different reasons, but, just to drink. So I learned a lot over there.
Did you check with others if that really was a culture, or if they were having you on just to
Yeah. And every year when I'm back in Vietnam, I have to do the same thing. So yeah, you're not supposed to drink a lot, but that's what I'm trying to say. Like sometimes you just have to kind of learn. Do you have to do that when you're doing your work?
So in the Himalaya, well, in Singapore, when we're doing the diving, of course, there's no drinking. No drinking when scuba diving. It's a less forgiving field experience diving. But in the Himalaya, well, you should be drinking either above a certain altitude. But we do like to have a nice little Roxy rice wine. Usually it's cloudy. It's homemade. So in central Himalaya, we have this Roxy, and one of my my colleagues in Nepal, he makes a special, his name is Mukia, and he makes a special version of it with a raw egg. It's really hardcore. The first time I saw it, I was like, really? We're going to drink that? He was like, yes, it's really good for you. You feel better and you have energy. And I was like, okay. And then after I got used to it, I actually, built up the habit of like liking it as a either, yeah, like I think you mentioned like for breakfast, right? They have it for breakfast.
Oh, for any meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, whichever.
So on a really cold winter.
Okay, we're not supposed to, but just saying.
Well, now everybody knows. So,
okay.
yeah, on a really cold day, we have it for breakfast, and after a really long day, we have it to wind down. But no copious amounts, and I guess the elevation makes sure that you cannot do that. We just cannot do that. So yeah, that's really exciting, setting up those bridges and navigating the politics and all that as well. In the Himalaya, that has been really challenging as well. And so I began working with the communities there in 2007. And at that time, that Nepal is one of those places where there are lots of researchers from all over the world. They're interested in that place because it's the Himalaya, right? There's like only one Himalaya in the whole world. So if you want to study high mountains, you got to go there. So there's lots of, the locals are not, unfamiliar with working with researchers. But our work is slightly different because we're not just passively collecting data. We really want to engage the people to understand the work that we're doing and actually participate in it. Because again, the way I see it is that the project, the goal, which is protecting the health of animals and people in the Himalaya, that is not going to be solved just with science and data. That is people actually wanting to protect their health and changing the behavior, taking the steps to modify their patterns, the way they interact with animals and livestock. And that is a very long, tedious process. So in the beginning, when we were doing that, just like anybody, even us, right? We have our own rituals and patterns and suddenly, of our day, and suddenly someone shows up and saying, that's not really a good idea. You really shouldn't be doing that. We take time to adjust, right? And I think a lot of us now that have been going through this lockdown, we're all learning a lot about adjustment. Right? We have to adjust, we have to be more patient with each other. And so it was really after about maybe about 4 or 5 years, I think it was about, yeah, that the locals started coming to us voluntarily without us having to go to them anymore. They were coming and reporting what they were finding. So it was sort of building a habit of us being there, participating. And that's one of the things that I'm missing most about not just myself being there in the field, but my other Nepali colleagues who are in Kathmandu. They can't go into the mountain areas as well. And as much as I would like to return to the field after this whole lockdown is over, I can't help but be worried that I could be an asymptomatic carrier. The last thing I want to do is actually bring the disease into rural isolated villages. And I think that's one of the things that is really really tenuous to think, like, it's difficult to think about how do we approach this in communities. Like for us, when we travel there, maybe we can get insurance or whatever, or be evacuated to a hospital. But if a local in those rural villages gets infected, then they may not have the same privileges to be affected. So yeah, so there's a challenge of restoring work. But as to navigating the politics, I'd like to go back about what you're saying about data, about the rope bridges. Is not just as simple as putting a rope bridge. You need to understand where you're putting that rope bridge. And the similarity that I can think of is that before we started work in the Himalaya, so we were trying to find out where these dogs are coming from. So basically contact tracing, right? Everybody now is familiar with these terms. Okay? We're trying to find out where these animals come from. Unfortunately, dogs don't buy bus tickets or airplane tickets, so we don't know where. We can't look at a manifest and figure out where they came from. We have to interview people, and everyone was under this belief, really, that it was tourists that were bringing in the dogs. And people were very convicted about that. So we started collecting data. We went to all the villages along, a various elevation, 10 different villages. We took photographs and individually identified every single dog. And we found out the owners or the territory of each of these dogs. And it turned out that it's not that there are a lot of dogs, they're being double counted. And you know all about that, right? Because they're moving from village to village. And so they show up in one place, everyone thinks that they're there. Yes, there are some transient dogs, but they're not the majority. The majority of the dogs are actually resident dogs that came into the area because they were brought there by people. And when we presented this data to the locals, it was quite difficult for them to accept it because they really strongly believe that the dogs were being brought in by tourists. So coronavirus happens overnight. No experiment would have had the power to do this, right? But no tourists in the Himalaya. And what's happening is that, so I still have, some of the residents have been really super helpful. They're still sending me like WhatsApp messages and there are dogs. They're like, where are these dogs coming from? There are no tourists. So the dogs are now roaming around looking for food, right? And that's one of the biggest drivers. I think many of us who live in cities, points of conflict between humans and wildlife often happen around food. In Singapore, when like the monkeys, right? Is the people who feed the monkeys and they accidentally get hurt by the monkeys. In the Himalaya, it's the same, where people dispose of food, and a lot of organic waste basically is thrown into a bucket at the back of the house, and any kind of animal, usually it's livestock, like some cows or goats will come around to nibble on it. But, in nightfall, jackals come in, dogs come in, foxes come in. And so there's a lot of open conflict. And it's really about modifying the behavior. And I think a very good experiment was done in the US, where basically to stop conflict between bears and people, they made bear-proof bins. And we've done some of that in Singapore as well, where we have created monkey-proof bins to minimize conflict. I think sometimes, without the facilitation or the proper data, it's easy to just believe whatever we want to believe, right? Like monkeys are bad, that's why they're attacking people. But
so
actually,
there's one point I wanted to just explain about monkey-proof bins that you mentioned. In some areas, those are good, so the monkeys can't actually go in to get the food. But in other areas, we have noticed that because there's a monkey-proof bin, people find it really troublesome to put their rubbish into the bin. So they will leave it outside the bin. So
you the monkeys.
I know. So in the end, you make it even easier for monkeys to get the food. So we need to think of ways where it's difficult for monkeys but easy for people. If not, they won't do it. So it's two ways.
That is a good point. That's exactly, yeah. So like on that, one of the things because we're working with disease control in the Himalaya, one of the recommendations we came up with for disposing of an animal that is believed to have died from an infectious disease is to actually burn it. Now that recommendation did not work because fuel is actually very expensive, and is very important for heating, for cooking, and the last thing people are going to do, unless it's cremating a relative, or for that fact, monkeys actually, they cremate monkeys too. But dogs culturally are disposed of either in the forest or into rivers, if they die. And so that recommendation didn't come through. So what you pointed out is really important. It's not just the objective, the effective, all things being considered perfect solution to the problem, but it has to be easy for people to do as well. So we are about 40 minutes in, and we did want to open up to for people to ask questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type into the chat. We do have one question here. And this is from Ying Shan, I think. And she asks, she would like to, so Andie, I think this is for both of us. She would like to find out what we think about wildlife consumption in the context of the spread of pandemics. She has worked with poor communities in Laos, and she finds it hard to tell them that they should not consume wildlife because they have insecure access to food, protein, due to lack of access to markets. And she has a few friends who feel like the conversation should shift towards eating less meat in general in modern societies. So people like you and I in cities, given that these are likely sourced from factory farms where animals are stressed and prone to diseases. And the demand for these meat actually drives deforestation. That is a very complex issue, but it's fantastic because it's very relevant, that dynamics and that wonderful awareness that what we do in the city has an impact on forests halfway across the world, which are being cleared for cattle raising. What would you say, Andie, because you have also worked in some of these Southeast Asian countries where they consume wild meat?
I guess with this pandemic and the link to wildlife markets and the bushmeat, a lot of people might think that because of this virus, people might be avoiding bushmeat a lot, and so wildlife populations might, have a chance to come back. But actually, in some areas in Africa that my colleagues are working in, they realized that consumption of bushmeat actually increased. And one of the reasons is because of the COVID situation, the social aspects and political aspects, they have less income. Economically, they are affected. So then they have to turn to, I would say, free access of food in the forest rather than purchasing meat. So then, they were saying that they would rather not die of hunger, versus dying from the virus. So then I guess with this situation and this question, it's very difficult to find an answer. Like you said, eating less meat will be good, but telling people to eat less meat might be really challenging. You need to provide alternative source of protein, cheaper access, to food produced sustainably. But in areas like you mentioned, whether is it in certain parts of Southeast Asia, these are not easy. So in order to address that, probably it has to come from, top down in some areas where they're able to make some systemic changes, where they can provide wider, easier access to foods like this. But what do you think?
Yeah, the wild meat issue is very complex, and it means different things when you say the same words in different places. So I was just in the US before I came here, where, as you know, so you studied in Colorado, and I was in Montana. Hunting is a big thing, but somehow it's not really perceived as wild meat, like wild. It's very much a part of the culture. And so is it in some parts of Asia, South America, and African countries. And the first thing that hit me when I learned about the push to close wildlife markets, I was just wondering to myself how challenging that is. And just because it's challenging doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen. There are many things that can improve our health and well-being that are difficult to do and worth overcoming. I have visited many. I used to work in illegal wildlife crime investigation throughout Southeast Asia and East Africa. I have visited some of these markets, and the conditions of the wild animals and the people who are handling them is not good, and definitely very dangerous. And often when there are pandemics, the first people who get impacted are the people who are directly associated with the wild harvest of these animals. So they are not in a win-win situation at all. They are doing this because they depend on it for an income. And if there is a disease emergence, they are the first ones that are impacted. So you're absolutely right that alternatives have to be given. I think that not only do alternatives have to be given, but generally people can do more for their environment and the animals around them if we build their social capacity. So you and I can do the work that we do because we wake up and we're not focused on the only thing today I have to think about is where am I going to get my breakfast. And I think that for many people living in the global south, where that is a daily reality, we have to, even though we're, as wildlife, we care about wildlife, we want to save wildlife, and the people that will save wildlife. And they can't save wildlife if they can't save themselves. And so I think, and it's just like what you're doing with, working with the communities in Vietnam, engaging people. Those are the things that can help improve well-being for people, which can then reduce the impact on wildlife trade and emerging pandemics. And I think Yannick has a question.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for letting us listen into this very, very interesting conversation. I guess my question is a bit philosophical, and it sort of, Jane Goodall, I think yesterday said something along the lines, if humanity doesn't learn out of the mistakes and what has happened, what has driven the corona crisis, then humanity is lost. So just sort of interested to hear sort of your views, and do you see any indications that humans are actually becoming more conscious of the environment that we're living in, more conscious of our action, how, even in cities like Hong Kong or Singapore, we can easily lose touch with nature because you live in an environment where everything's provided, everything's coming from somewhere else. That things are going to change. And there were these videos of otters going back and taking over Singapore, for example, which is a short-term quick encouragement. But what's your thought? I mean, do you think that there are positive impacts in the long run for this, or are you? Looking in your glass bowls, like, what are your thoughts on this?
I guess for me, it's like you mentioned, because of this pandemic, and we had to make a lot of changes to our behavior, such as traveling or being more conscious about, the environment. I think it depends on what happened when all this is over. Like, are we going to revert back to our behavior before this happened? Or we can actually do changes from within. So it's not just the government telling you that you should be doing this and that, or like conservationists telling you that it's bad for the environment, but that because you see it happen during this probably 1 whole year or 2 years, where we are in this pandemic together, that it's important to be aware of the importance of protecting the environment, protecting nature, not just for nature's sake, but for yourself as well, because the food that we eat, the air that we breathe, the climate that we live in, they're all from nature. So I think it's only when, probably time will tell. I don't have the answer now. I'm hoping for positive change, but yeah, I agree with Dr. Jane Goodall that if we don't actually use this opportunity to make real changes, it might be too late, but I'm still hopeful. Debbie?
I think that I think like Andie and I have had the opportunity to see the difference between social attitudes across like quite a useful length of time. So back when I started doing work with animals, you mentioned anything animal welfare. It was no one was interested about it. But now if you go on the street, for example, just using how we interact with domestic animals, for example, in our landscape. When I was a kid, people would not think twice about kicking a cat in the street. But now no one would dare do that. You know, you're not going to get away with doing that. And those are the things that we can see in the city right now that have changed about people's attitudes. I think what I feel we learn from reflecting from our experience is also how we have a role of facilitating that interaction with nature. So often nature means different things to different people. I think we see this now during the pandemic. There are people who will go to beautiful places and vandalize it, as has happened in Joshua Tree National Park in the US. And you have people who go to places because they enjoy the pristine nature, but basically people are looking for different things. And I think how we interact is contingent on that facilitation. So again, it's opportunity by facilitators like myself and Andie to reach out, engage, talk with people rather than across people, over people, to learn the differences, how to speak differently to different people. Different people have different values and different things that are important to them. I also recognize we have 10 minutes left, and I would like to pick these questions here in the chat. Can you elaborate about diving in Singapore? Thank you, Dimitri, for asking that question. So in Singapore, I'm part of an organization, a volunteer-run organization that is trying to protect coral reefs. We're called the Hantu blog, and our website is pulauhantu.sg. I'm going to type it into the chat so you can see it. But basically, just like Andie, who's trying to protect very endangered forests in a relentlessly developing urban landscape in Singapore, my organization, the Hantu Bloggers, is trying to protect coral reefs by raising awareness about our threatened reefs in Singapore, which surprisingly enough, even though we are an island surrounded by water and I can actually see the sea from where I am right now, many people have not experienced Singapore reefs and remain disconnected from it. Thank you for asking that question. Someone else has a question about canned hunting. This is interesting. We don't really have canned hunting. Well, we don't have canned hunting in Asia. So Andie, I don't know if you're familiar with canned hunting, but basically lions are bred in an enclosed area. They are effectively ranched for hunting. So this is a very contentious question, a contentious issue. Some saying that that is good because it creates livelihoods for people. But I think so the evidence has been that I think there has been maybe one example of, I don't know if it was a can hunt, but there is one safari, I guess that's what you call it, that has had success with controlled hunting. I don't think it is canned hunting, however. So it's just like they have a quota on the animals that can be hunted, but they're not bred specifically for hunting. They just proliferate on their own. Personally, I have a colleague, two colleagues actually, in South Africa who work with can hunting. And so I've had some first-hand, well, not first-hand, I guess second-hand experience with from some of the data that they have collected. And my personal take is that, my very limited personal take is that it isn't, I don't see how we can nurture an attitude for caring for wildlife, interacting with wildlife in a sustainable way, by at the same time nurturing an attitude that we can breed them for hunting. That is my take. Obviously, it is a very complex issue, and there are a lot of exceptions, I think, to the case. But what do you think, Andie?
Yeah, I agree with you, because when you do that, what you're creating is disrespect for wild animals like them. And I think, secondly, this kind of income, I do not think that it's going to be, benefiting a whole lot of people. So it's going to be just a small group of people benefiting from this probably huge income. So I don't think there's any, to answer to that question, I don't think there's any humane way that we can do that. I mean, yeah, that's just my take.
Yeah, I actually have, again, another colleague who again was also from South Africa, not working with can hunting, but working with the, well, sort of studying whether government managed national parks fare better than privately managed national parks. And this happens in some countries. I think Malaysia also has some countries, like some national parks which are privately managed, based on the idea that, okay, it's easier to finance the costs associated with looking after a national park if it's privately run. And she was looking at the impact of poaching between both of the areas, and there was no difference. So I think, you know, the management, again, this is of course limited to the particular national parks that she looked at. But I think that, again, going back to the attitudes that we are nurturing of people, the people who are living around the park, what are their attitudes? What are their what is their capacity? How are they involved in the national park? I have a very, you know, when I went to this place, you're looking at your kitty. There was a national park that I visited in Nepal. Here's Chin Chow. Oh, so adorable.
Sorry, please continue. She just woke up, so yeah, hello.
And she was kisses already. Yeah, so there was a national park. And this is the project by a friend of mine, Ishana Thapa. She's with BirdLife International in Nepal. And they had a very innovative approach to forest conservation. So they had forest users actually participate 100%. So the backstory is that old-fashioned conservation is fortress style, right? Build a fence, tell people they cannot do anything in the forest. Wildlife stays inside, people stay outside. In some countries that works, especially in developed countries where national parks or parks are paid for by taxpayer money. In countries which are developing, like the global south, they are not financed by taxpayer money. And people depend a lot on forest resources. So that fortress style in this particular national park in Pulchoki in Nepal did not work. So they tried a new strategy, which was to, they call it give thieves the keys. Thieves because they were the ones that were always crossing the fence to cut down trees. But then what if we give them the keys and tell them, okay, you tell us how you want to manage this resource for your long-term benefit. And they started this women's group, of course, to manage how everyone uses the resources. And so they came up with their own system, which are the areas you can access, how to cut things, where to cut them, what season to cut it. And the most interesting thing was that they finally asked the people, what is important to you? And they learned that inside the forest, there were 4 ancient stupas. So stupas are little stone temples, like built usually for in Hindu culture. So 4 stupas that were derelict, and these stupas were really valuable to the community, but they were in ruin. So they asked, how can we restore these stupas? So the conservationists, these people who just wanted to protect birds, called in archaeologists to ask how they can restore the stupa. And the people also wanted to clean up the lake, which was polluted by rubbish. So they said, how can we get rid of the rubbish, and how can we restore these stupas? So then this exchange developed, where they created the facilities, the platform to help people. So the bird people were saying, I'm sorry, all the bird people in this group, I have to call you bird people. I know you're normal people, but the people who wanted to protect birds,
Monkey people.
Yeah. Hey, I get called the distemper girl, okay? That is not...
Oh no!
I know. But anyway, so yeah, so the people wanted to protect birds, were looking after the rain, got people to protect forest resources, and the local community got what they want. And I think there are stories like these emerging all over the world. There's also another story out of Ecuador, which was the same thing, a guy who wanted to protect birds that ended up giving people basically water, because that's why, that's what was important to them, basically clean water. You know, so many people, just basic needs. And I think in conservation, a lot of things we don't learn in university, but those are the things that we have to ask questions to, and listen and be curious. So we have already reached an hour. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this wonderful conversation. It was so good to have all of you and for you guys to have some questions. Thank you, Yannick, for organizing.
Thank you, Yannick.
And it was super to be able to catch up with Andie and Chin Chow over the chat. Chin Chow is the name of her silver cat. And this recording, this conversation was recorded, and it will be, we intend to post it on YouTube. We will ask you for your permission, those of you who have signed up to the RSVP, whether that is okay with you. If you do not think that is okay, please let us know. Hi, Naomi. Thanks for coming in. Naomi is also a National Geographic Explorer working with sharks. Maybe we should speak to her one day. But yeah, thank you, Andie. I hope we all get to go to the field again soon. Continue your great work with monkeys. One day, I would like to climb up into a tree with you.
Yep.
Looks like fun. Hanging in a tall tree. Yeah.
Yeah. Do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks,
you, Yannick.
everyone.
And thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.